Let's dive into the mailbag here. If you want to write us an email about anything, ask me. I love reading these questions. I appreciate your comments. You can ask me about anything. You can send it to the Joel Klatt Show mailbag at gmail.com. Okay, so Tyler T writes in. And this mailbag, by the way, is sponsored by Hampton by Hilton. Hilton for the stay. And Tyler T writes, and he says, any thoughts on Chip Kelly's idea on realignment? Well, if you haven't heard, this is what Chip Kelly had to say about college football and realignment.
I think we need to have a conference commissioner. I think football should be separate from the other sports. Just the fact that our school is leaving to go to the Big Ten in football, our softball team should be playing Arizona in softball. Our basketball team should be playing Arizona in basketball. But because football left, and they're saying, well, how do you do that? Well, Notre Dame's independent in football, and they're in a conference and everything else. I think we should all be independent in football. And you can have a 64-team conference that's in the Power Five, and you can have a 64-team conference in the Group of Five. And we separate it, and we play each other. You can sponsor each one. Instead of calling it Group of Five and Power Five, you can call it Amazon, Nike, bid that out to things. You do a lot of different things. But I think if we still do the same thing and take all that money, and I would do this, and I think this needs to be done, that money now needs to be shared with the student athletes, and there needs to be revenue sharing. The players should get paid, and you can get rid of NLI, and the schools should be paying the players because the players are what the product is.
Man, there was a lot in there, and good for Chip, and good for, because now he says what Jim Harbaugh has been saying, and he talks about revenue sharing with the players. There was a lot to unpack in there. So Tyler, I appreciate your question, and I want to get into it. Here's what I really liked about Chip's answer. Number one is that football at its highest level has got to separate. And so that idea, when he said like, why football can be independent of the other sports, he was talking about it from a conference perspective. But I just think that, like, if you actually just take it a step further, like, this idea of football separating, I think is very important and needs to happen. And when you separate, what you can start to do is think about an overarching governing body or entity. He said commissioner, but again, it's more the idea. Okay, so he's bringing up specific ideas, and that specificity is obviously interesting, and people love to hear it. And I think that's what generates clicks. But remember, it's obviously more about the ideas that he is floating, and namely, the separation of football is a really important one. I do believe that football needs to separate from the other sports because the economics of football are so vastly different. And he's right. UCLA softball should be playing Arizona and Stanford and Cal and Oregon State and Washington State, and Arizona, as he said. That's absolutely true. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true for the football program because the economics of football are vastly different. And this idea that we should govern and think about UCLA football or Ohio State football or Alabama football in the same way that we would think about and govern UCLA softball, Ohio State softball, and Alabama softball is obviously wrong. That structure we've got to move away from. We really need to. And the only reason that we get stuck in these positions where we start to throw Band-Aids on these pop-up problems is because we're stuck in this model where we've got to make a rule that applies to Alabama Crimson Tide football and Nick Saban as well as UCLA softball. And that is so obviously problematic that we need to move away from that. So this idea that Chip had, and he's not the first one, and we've talked about it on this show, among other shows that talk about it all the time. The separation of football is a big one, and that leads to a governing structure. If it's a commissioner, great. If it's the college football playoff entity, that can be a governing structure. great. But the quicker that we can move away from the NCAA and this idea of Band-Aid issues over pop-up problems, the better. Okay. The number 2 thing that he touched on there, and I think this is vital and important, is scheduling fixes. And it was nuanced, and he was talking more about structure there, but he also kind of threw in the scheduling apparatus. And if football can separate, and if we can get to a point where we're governing ourselves in a different way, what we can do is start to fix the schedule. And fixing the schedule, I think, is a vital piece to not only continuing to grow the sport from an interest perspective, but also continue to drive revenue, because that's the way that we're going to continue to grow. And driving revenue is not so that everybody can get rich, but it's so that you can do what he talked about, which is share in the revenue structure with the players, which I also think is important and gets to the third thing that he touched on, which was the rev share. And when you get to that point, here's what you get: the opportunity to collectively bargain with players. And once we can get to that point, then you can put guardrails on all of these issues that will make them all better. Now, is it ever going to be utopia? No. I mean, the NFL still has problems, and that's why they have CBA agreements, and they've had work stoppages, and they've had lockouts and holdout. They've had all of that. And I'm not saying that it would just be all teddy bears and unicorns, but I am telling you that in that sense, everybody moving in the same direction, we get out of our silos, we separate, we start fixing the schedule, we start fixing the governance of the sport, then we can get more organized. We can take care of players in a better way than what we're doing now. One, we can give them rev share, and we can provide guardrails that protect them from themselves, like I was just talking about in the last answer. The one pushback that I would have there that he talked about is he talked about like college football in terms of like this 132 team entity, and even a 64 team entity and a 64 team entity, 2 entities. But if we're honest with ourselves, there is such a vast difference even from team 132 in college football and team 1 in college football from a resource and commitment standpoint. That would probably need to get ratcheted down, because I still think that conferences are important. That doesn't mean that the softball team has to follow the football team into whatever conference that is. I think football should be independent to move into the conferences necessary in order to continue to drive interest in the sport. And I do think that that's important. And it can't just be divisions, and it can't just, be regionalized. Personally, conferences drive the sport in a big way, and they also drive revenue, and that type of resource and revenue is what we need in order for that last point about the rev share. So really cool stuff from Chip. Like I said, I really loved what he was talking about. He's a smart guy. That's why I went and talked to him on Big Noon Conversations, and I'm glad that he jumped in that fray that Jim Harbaugh has jumped into in terms of that rev share model. Thank you for watching the Joel Klatt Show YouTube channel. And if you liked this clip, make sure to like it and subscribe to the channel, and you can stay up to date on all of my college football coverage.